Weapons is a 2025 movie about a small town that gets beset on by a devastating event. Now, this movie I was really looking forward to. Written and directed by Zach Cregger, whose last movie was Barbarian, which I loved the first half of, but then I thought it kind of shifted in a way that leaned a little too much into the silly territory for me, which kind of more on that later. This is his second movie, seemed to be a lot darker and a lot more grounded. It also had a great premise, and the trailer didn't give too much away. In my opinion, there should be a rule that trailers are only allowed to show footage from the first act of a movie. Just give me the setup/premise. Stop showing me a trailer that makes me feel like I watched a 2-minute version of the entire film. Sorry, that just drives me crazy. It's why I now try to avoid most trailers of films if I can. Anyway, Weapons tells the story of a certain time at night on a certain date where all of the children of a certain classroom ran out of their house and was not seen from again. If you've seen the trailer, it explains the premise quite clearly.
So this one Wednesday is like a normal day for the whole school. But today was different. Every other class had all their kids. But Mrs. Gandy's room was totally empty. And you know why? Because the night before, at 2:17 in the morning, every kid woke up, got out of bed, walked downstairs, and into the dark. And they never came back.
It centers on a couple of characters throughout the film in a somewhat similar fashion to Barbarian, where it breaks up its narrative amongst different perspectives. This is a great premise full of possibilities. And as a tone and mood of the film, it really comes out of the gate strong. Except for the prologue. So the trailer that you may or may not have seen, that is basically the first 4 or 5 minutes of the film. It is a long narration where a random little girl describes everything that has happened in this little town.
A lot of people die in a lot of really weird ways in this story, but you're not going to find it in the news or anywhere like that.
It is an odd choice for sure, because it's basically just a giant exposition dump.
They asked him if there was a TV show where someone ran away like that.
And one that I would argue is completely unneeded, because everything that is in this prologue is then repeated by the characters almost immediately in the film.
Today, none of her kids were there. Every other class at that school had all their kids. Even the other 3rd grade Mrs. Belt taught was full. But Mrs. Gandy's room was totally empty.
17 kids in one classroom. What happened in that classroom? Why just her classroom? Why only hers?
In my opinion, they should have chopped that whole intro off and just started with the first character's perspective and just let the audience learn about what happened through the characters versus in this giant exposition dump like that. But, that's the choice that they went with. So Justine, played by Julia Garner, is a school teacher whose class was the class of children that had disappeared. And so, as you would imagine, the town's looking for answers and turning to her. She doesn't seem to have any answers, and it becomes a really nice character study of when a group of people who are pushed to the edge, aka the loss of their children, start to latch on to anything they can for answers or responsibility. Now, amongst the parents is Archer, played by Josh Brolin, who's a construction worker and will not accept that Justine has no answers. Justine, who has taken to drinking, is pushed into a forced absence from school by the principal, played by Benedict Wong, and she has an on-again, off-again relationship with a police officer in town named Paul, played by Alden Ehrenreich. So for the first half of the movie, it's not only a really grounded and compelling mystery as to what happened to these kids, but it's also how the people in this small town are reacting to the tragic events and their desperation. It almost feels a little Stephen King to me in that way, which I really appreciated. But that's the setup and the first half of the movie, which I thought was really solid. The look and feel of the film is excellent, with a dark atmosphere, really good cinematography, and a fascinating human story element, as well as a creepy suggestion of something evil and nefarious and supernatural lurking in the darkness. The movie then incorporates a kind of an interesting shift that I think both works and doesn't work in its favor. I mean, the movie isn't always told from one person's perspective throughout the film. It starts off with Justine, and we stick with her for a while, but then it shifts to Archer and his perspective as a desperate father. Then shifts to Paul, and so on and so on and so on. Now, this is a cool idea that allows to see the situation from different sides, so that's the good. The bad is I think it hampers the overall progression of the story a lot. Let me explain. So as the pieces start to come into place and the larger picture begins to come together, the tension builds among these characters' individual perspectives as they begin to investigate what is going on. But not all of the characters are investigating. And so because that, not all of them are actively pushing the story forward. Instead, you have one character doing something to push the main story forward, and then it shifts to someone else, and the progress of that story gets shoved back as we almost Groundhog Day it from the other character's point of view. That acts as a sort of reset on the tensions, as it then has to build back up to get to where the other characters are time-wise. And then the story moves forward a little bit more, and then bam, goes to another character. Reset. It's this constant 2 steps forward, 3 steps back approach that I thought made the pacing for me a bit uneven and gave it a stop and start motion I didn't really like. Not all the characters have an equal stake in pushing the story forward. Some are there for one small discovery, but we still spend a bunch of time with them. So it feels like we're cutting away from a compelling mystery and the steps people are taking to solve it, to pushing it to the sidelines to wait for the rest of the characters to catch up so we can get another morsel of information. Now there's this old editing adage called "meanwhile back at the ranch."
If you tell a story that's and then they and then and that, you're in big trouble. You want to have 2 things going. You reach the peak of one, you go to the other. You pick the other up just where you want it. When it loses interest, drop it. Meanwhile back at the ranch.
Now that's a great approach in keeping people engaged, but only if each story you cut to is engaging itself. Now this movie has one really engaging storyline and a bunch of small D-plots about a junkie, a principal, a cheating husband, and dirty cop. And so I just kept waiting to get back to the main story of the missing children, which I thought was the interesting one. And it just took forever to circle back around to it. Now, I won't get too heavy into the plot details because the mystery that unfolds doesn't take a lot of actions to figure out. It takes a lot of time because of all the shifting perspectives, but if it had been a more traditional story that just followed the 2 main characters, they really only do like 2 things and then figure it out. But that ends up taking the entire movie, and that was kind of disappointing. Now, the other thing I thought was an odd choice was the tonal shift in the second half of this film. Now, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised, as Barbarian did a similar thing where it shifts gears in a way I didn't love. This started out so grounded and serious, but then it got increasingly lighter and lighter until by the end of the movie it kind of got full-on comedic. Now, clearly that is Zach Cregger's style and he loves it. And given the success of the film itself, many people like this too. But for me, I prefer the exact opposite. Like, make it light in the beginning and then make it darker and more serious as it goes along. And so that way the ending feels like there are really stakes and consequences. For me, laughing at the end of a horror movie feels like letting up on the gas right as you see the finish line. And it turns into something that could have been effective to just kind of silly. Anyway, to wrap this up, Weapons has a great concept and a compelling idea. It's shot beautifully, has some excellent performances throughout, but the execution just felt a little lacking for me, especially in the back third. Now, the split perspectives was clever at first, but then I thought it detracted from the story because it just repeated a lot of the same beats and didn't continue to drive the story forward in a meaningful way. Now, I think this could have been tightened up a lot to have a more even pacing, because I found myself constantly wanting to get back to that main storyline throughout the film. Now, the movie wasn't boring, and lots of things do happen, and there is some genuinely creepy moments here. So I just would have preferred to stick with that tone instead of trying to infuse comedy into it later on in the picture. I'd give this movie a B, but let me know what you think.